DEI programs made things worse for women leaders, according to Harvard. In this video, I'll walk through what their study said and why, and thank you to this commenter for putting this on my radar on my video about the glass cliff for women in underrepresented racial groups. If you don't know me, I'm Dr. Anna Kalschmidt. I'm an industrial organizational psychologist who specializes in social class dynamics in the workplace, and I always look at race, gender, and neurodivergent intersections as well. I'm also a woman who has been in leadership positions and is now an entrepreneur, so I have some lived experience in some of this. So for the first time in 11 years, McKinsey's Women in the Workplace report found that women are seeking less promotional opportunities. And in the 11 years they've been doing that report, that's never shown up to be true. So why, as recently as 2025, 61 years after the Civil Rights Act passed, do things appear to be worse? Harvard Business Review published this article because it was their every 20-year update that they have promised to do since their initial one in 1965 called Are Women Executives People? I'm not kidding. And they tell us how intentionally provocative that title was, as Harvard has always been woke. Conveniently, when I tried to find that original article to show you, I couldn't find anything, and Google Scholar flagged me as a bigot. And as always, we have to consider the context of the time, and that Harvard looking into this at all in 1965 was a big deal, and that they've continued to look at this every 20 years is great. And we can also acknowledge that we shouldn't purify our histories, and that Harvard has not always let women in, even as students, and has admitted that many of their male faculty, before they allowed women in, relied on their wives to do a lot of their work. Women weren't let into the College of Education, notice not even the whole school until 1920. That was probably white women. Black men weren't let in until the late 1800s. Why am I pointing this out? One, because I'm a pain in the ass and a history nerd. And two, because remember that the rule sticks that everyone are being measured against were made before 1964. Were made when things like this were normalized. Were made when nobody else was allowed to be in the room. And when you have situations like this, where what is considered normal and professional is only developed by one group of people, you run into the problems I'm going to talk about. So back to women in leadership. This recent study by Harvard found the usual that we've known for decades. Women are held to a higher bar than men are. Men are rated on potential, women on achievements. And when women achieve, they have to prove it over and over and over again. It's seen as a fluke. This happens to men of color too, so I didn't appreciate that this article didn't seem to define who men and women are in these instances. In my own research on the unwritten rules of work, the first paper is what I talk about a lot on here, is the basis of what became my book, even though I've done more studies since then. But the second paper was on how these norms uphold white supremacy culture. One of the norms of white supremacy culture is perfectionism. In my work, and this was only one study, this was not a meta-analysis, white women brought this up the least, white men brought it up the most, but when you read the quotes, white men are saying that other people are held to higher standards than they are. Some of them know it. Not all of it, but some of them know it. And half of the respondents, black men and black women, talked about being held to this. If you're interested in reading that paper, it's linked in my bio for free. To continue with the Harvard review, they also reminded us of a big paper that splashed in 2010 on that merit, organizations that perceive themselves as having merit are often the ones that are most unfair. That a lot of organizations who said they had merit actually had greater bias in favor of men, even if women were performing equally as well. Again, it doesn't go into class or race or ability dynamics, which is what my research is interested in, but it tells us something. And usually when something is there for one group, it doesn't spare the others. The irony of why these organizations that claim to have merit are often worse is not because merit doesn't matter, but because merit is often interpreted in organizations and is not actually measured. Ain't that the summary of the point? In this space of interpretation is where bias lives. In this space are where unwritten rules abound. I define unwritten rules of work as the implicit, unofficial guidelines that govern behavior, communication, and decision-making in professional settings. They are often the cultural values that everyone is assumed to know. Now, what are the cultural values going to be if everyone before 1964 was a white man? And inherently, as a class researcher, I have to point out to you that who had the authority and decision-making power to decide what those rules were? It wasn't the poor ones. And we are still in 2026 having to explain to people why autism and ADHD aren't worse than dying from measles. So do you think many disabled people were involved in that? continuing with the point. Why does Harvard say this has gotten worse in the past 20 years? Because while we made progress for the first 40, slow, but some progress, Harvard says that it then became political to have DEI programs. I have conflicting feelings about this because 1964 and Civil Rights Act and affirmative action were all very political then. However, as someone who grew up in rural South, very conservative, Bible Belt, I was not taught, at least as a millennial, by the time we got to where we came around in the 80s and 90s, that I was not taught that civil rights was a bad thing or unfair or that DEI or anything about that was bad. They still had feelings about affirmative action, or I should say who I was taught when I was raised to believe, but it was not what it has become. So I think that's a pretty bold claim in this article to say that it became political. I would say it more became weaponized again. Because now, instead of looking at bias as something that can impact anyone and should be addressed by everyone, especially, as I point out in my book and in my research and what IO psychology points out all the time, is that if you want to have good company performance, you have to reduce bias. You should be measuring what matters. You shouldn't be operating on these unspoken rules, on the office politics, on biases. These are things that help you get lower performers and help you create spaces where people do not want to stay and work, and all of that is very expensive. And Gallup was a big pioneer of this in the 80s and 90s on showing how important employee engagement has been for company bottom lines, which is probably why my millennial ass didn't hear as much shit about it, even in the rural South in America. But that changes when people feel like their team doesn't support something or it does. And so when you make something that, hey, bias doesn't impact all of us, that's just what those libtards want you to think. Now all workers are going to be fucked, but especially the ones that bias already impacted. So let me read you this from the Harvard report. In our survey, women leaders reported the same hidden barriers at work regardless of political leanings, which if you know my page, you know two things are true. I've never supported Donald Trump and I never will. And I also talk hella shit about places that think they are too progressive to have problems. Most recently, when I made my video about racism showing up in California, when I worked in the Bay Area, the things I'm talking about in this video are the things that we implemented at the project I was on at Stanford to reduce bias, and it improved our performance tremendously. As well as I have several videos about how nonprofits and places that claim to have social justice-oriented missions are often brutal to people from underrepresented backgrounds because they can't handle the feedback on that. While we know that words like racism and sexism are wrong, these subtle unwritten things still aren't getting addressed, and because people don't want to believe that they have it, they don't do anything about it. Not everyone. I've had some nonprofits who have had me come in up to 4 times to help them with this stuff. They care. But a lot still want to stick their head in the sand. So you see how this doesn't help the women and leaders or anyone? If now your team doesn't have these issues, then you're not going to look into resolving them. While before, we had that brief period where it was less of a team thing, then it didn't threaten anybody's identity. I'll continue reading from the Harvard article. Growing political polarization is turning women's workplace challenges into a political fight. Research shows that when a real issue like bias gets linked to a politically charged solution like DEI programs, people stop talking about the issue and argue about the solution instead. As a result, the problem gets ignored and the everyday barriers women face stay in place. However, while rollbacks of DEI initiatives have added new challenges, these programs frequently failed as many companies focused on visible efforts, like policies and statements, without changing the processes that actually determined who got ahead. And that is the tremendous irony behind all of the DEI backlash, as I understand why people are mad because it wasn't done well. And then there's also the who has remained in power has not changed much. When formal DEI programs were reduced, it removed the window dressing and made the real decision-making patterns more obvious. One executive explained that after their company paused its inclusion efforts for legal reasons, leaders suddenly only talked about performance in promotion discussions. Employees who had once felt recognized as rising leaders started to wonder if they were still truly being considered for future roles. So it no longer became clear what performance was and what it meant. And one of the unwritten rules of work for my research is indirect communication. Not giving clear feedback, not being clear about what you want. There is no fairness if people do not know what the standard is, and it is not held to everyone. So what does this mean for when we get to the point of the McKinsey report finding that women are not seeking promotions as frequently as men are anymore? The report found that that gap goes away as soon as women receive the same amount of support that men get. Let's return to the Harvard article. A gap between formal organizational programs and the informal dynamics that formal policy does not reach. One CFO-level executive described being hired to succeed her organization's departing CFO. She'd been fully vetted and approved. Yet 2 months into the role, she was asked to attend a board dinner, but not the board meeting itself, so that the board members who had already approved her could become comfortable. No policy was violated. No formal grievance was available. But the message about whose authority required additional ratification was unmistakable. This is the structure of underground bias, and it is where the explanation of our data lives. You know what that sounds like? This is why I wrote my book and why I started doing this research a decade ago. Yes, as a little redneck white woman from rural North Florida. I know that's hard to picture while I look like Meredith Blake, but hey, a girl has range. I can put on this hat and still eat a squirrel. Thank you. And write a book. Here's an excerpt from it that's really relevant to this article. I finished writing this in September 2025. It just recently came out. DEI programs. Many interpret DEI programs as preferencing one group over another. The group that DEI intends to support. The groups that DEI intend to support often say the new policies are fair because of intentional discrimination that has historically been against them. Again, why I showed you the Harvard clips in the beginning. And yet, many of us know that there seems to be a secret game being played at work. Some people know it, and others don't. From my researcher's perspective, merit cannot be entertained without access to this knowledge. The core message of this book is that most of us aren't happy at work right now, and many attempts to resolve these issues have failed miserably. This isn't always because of poor intent, but because the less visible, unwritten components of misery were never addressed. They are simply perceived as normal. These unwritten rules not only make most of us want to run away and sell coconuts on a beach somewhere, they are also quite costly for organizations. Now, in addition to this being a book that has over 400 citations at the end, the last 70 pages of the book are just citations. The first 300-ish pages of the book include, yes, findings from my research, findings from other research, and examples of where I have seen this in my applied experience as someone who has worked in the public, private, and academic sectors. I already gave you a little teaser about the interventions we did at Stanford. But most of my experience is not in academia. It's in public and private sector consulting. And I actually have a slightly different recommendation than what the Harvard article has. Who am I to compete with Harvard? I'm going to have the same audacity as the dudes in my comments trying to explain to me my own field. So that's all I have to tell you there. The article talks about how still to this day, only 16% of COO roles go to women. I guarantee you most of those are white women, and I guarantee most of them aren't eating squirrel. They specify COO because that is the most common path to CEO positions. So again, I reiterate the point. While we've had these DEI programs and such, who has actually been in power has not changed much. The Harvard article points out that most of the women who get to this 16% had specific programs that helped women get to this point. And that is why they advocate for why taking away the additional programs is harmful. I think this is why we need to look at the unwritten rules and systems and not just look at additional add-ons. As long as there are any groups receiving additional support because the system itself is failing, it is always going to be perceived as unfair. Do I agree with that? Not necessarily, but hear me out. If the system is unfair enough to exclude, we have to look at rebuilding it and not just putting band-aids on broken bones. Because the reality is that the unfairness of these systems that were made on a very narrow definition of a person, of what a professional is, are pissing off most people, and they often miss the mark because they still have a very narrow idea of who this is impacting. And that's why my work on class resonates with so many people. Because even look at this quote from one of my research participants who's a white woman from Appalachia. First generation to go to college, first generation to be in a professional, quote-unquote, position. She told me how she doesn't identify with a lot of perceptions of femininity, that those are very white, upper-middle-class perceptions. She says, about womanhood, you're supposed to suppress and wait and not take up too much space. And I'm just not really good at that. I'm not really good at being the small, quiet woman. And I think for me, one of the realizations was that it is a middle-class performance of femininity. It is not a working class reality of what it means to be a woman. Because I grew up with these women that were like, I'm just telling you how it is. And my mom, my God, without precarity, she would just tell her bosses off if they did something inappropriate. And she totally should have, because they were being assholes. But I just couldn't believe that she had the strength to be like, no, that's a boundary. Nope. And you know, it could have cost her. So I just don't come from women who are like mousy. Even the images you see on TV of Southern women who are, I don't know, it has a plantation feel. Southern women like steel magnolias. I'm just like, that's not how that works. That's a certain group of people. Now, I both love steel magnolias, and you will never hear me disrespect my spiritual grandmother, Dolly Parton. But I get what she's saying. And when we don't look at all the other ways that intersect with shaping all of our identities, the class, the neurodivergence, the race, we are always missing the mark, and these programs will always not be enough. Because underlying all of these is the assumption that there is one right way to be a professional and everyone else needs support, and that is always going to cause backlash for these people. And people start to perceive it as the alphabet soup problem. Instead of, the irony is saying, why do most people, because it is most people, not fit in to what is rewarded at work? And then my research, because I'm an IO, so I look at people and organizations, also shows that a lot of these unwritten rules backfire for organizations. They don't make you more money long term. They do ruin your reputation. And unless you have caboodles of venture capital money, which is a real reality, you're going to be losing money. And even then, the venture capital runs out eventually. So what are my recommendations? I would say you need to know what the unwritten rules in your organization are. And if you're in a leadership position, you likely do not know what they are because they are being hidden from you. One of the unwritten rules is compliance, that you don't disagree with people in power. And if you do, you have to do so very carefully, even if they're asking for it, even if they have the appearance that they're asking for it. So if you ask your people face to face, they're not going to tell you. Not if you do have that unwritten rule present. So if they tell you, then you probably don't. You see what I mean? You need to do an unwritten rules audit. Send me a message if you want help with that. You need to know how these unwritten rules are impacting your organization. If they are helping you out, then you need to make them transparent. If they're not, then you're going to need to write a new rule. Now is not the time to be playing with stupid decisions. And if you're somewhere in between that decision-making power, you should check out my book. Each chapter has discussion on what the unwritten rules are, how we've seen it played out, what the research says, and recommendations for staff, people leaders, and human resources. The office world is not very old, so it's very silly how quickly we have adapted to that there is only one right way to be. And now with all the disruption with AI, and frankly, world stability, now that we don't have the safety net of, well, we can just keep doing business as usual, we don't want to change, we're all having to go through change. So we might as well make it work for all of us. Follow for more. I have almost 2,000 videos on here for free. And check out the book. It's probably linked somewhere if you're watching this on YouTube, and it's absolutely my link tree in my bio. Let me know what your follow-up questions are.